Hello my friends, in this video I want to show you a new translation of Genesis 1 that brings out features of the text usually lost in translation. Recently I've been studying Genesis 1 again, and why wouldn't I? There's so much depth to this text. It's worthy of a lifetime of study. Previously, when I began to study Genesis 1 in depth, I memorized it in Hebrew so I could recite it over and over. In meditating on this passage, I realized there were features of the text that no English translation had captured. I wish I had a translation that did capture them. So after living in the text for a while, I created my own translation. Now, I'm not saying all the other translations are bad, but I will say there are very few of them that emphasize what I've emphasized in mine. And I want you to see in English the amazing features of this passage that I saw in the Hebrew. One of the first things I noticed is it's hard to tell where a sentence ends or when to take a breath. That's because every new phrase begins with "and." Again, every single phrase in the chapter after the first starts with "and." Here you can see it in my translation. Now if you remember conjunction junction, what's your function? "And" is used for hooking up phrases and clauses. They're all connected together like cars on a train. And all the verses from Genesis 1:1 down to Genesis 2 verse 3 are hooked together into a single mega sentence. If it were a train, it might have 34 cars, one for each verse. This is amazing. I'd never seen it before until I learned it in Hebrew, but this entire chapter and 3 more verses are one long run-on sentence. That's why it's hard to know where to put a period and where to take a breath. The sentence doesn't end, not until Genesis 2:4. Did you ever have an English teacher who rebuked you for a long run-on sentence? I did. But if Moses had turned in this sentence to my English teacher, he would have immediately flunked the class. To try and capture the sense of one big long sentence in my translation, I've started a new line for each phrase and highlighted the word "and" spelled with a lowercase a. As you can see, some of the clauses are so long they have to wrap around to a new line. In essence, I've written it as a run-on sentence so you can see what I saw in reciting the Hebrew from memory. So the obvious question to ask at this point is why? Why would the author run all these verses together without stopping? If you look through the rest of the Old Testament, this isn't a common feature of Hebrew. It didn't have to be done this way. Well, what's going on here is rhetoric, a sophisticated technique of language. This one's called a polysyndeton. Poly means many, syn means together, and de is from deo, to tie or bind. So it means many things bound together into one. Polysyndeton. There's your vocabulary word for the day. Try it out on your friends. So this polysyndeton technique in Genesis 1 and the first part of 2 is tying together all these verses into a single unit. The creation week. Just like our work week is a single unit with no gaps in it, so is the creation week described in Genesis 1 all the way to chapter 2 verse 3. And the author wants us to think of it as a single unit, so he has tied it all together with a polysyndeton. How cool is that? Another thing the polysyndeton does is create a sense of urgency and speed. Every event is tumbling out practically on top of the last one, all run together quickly. And it compresses all that time into a short form that gives you a sense of how much was accomplished. Think about how long it would take us humans to manufacture the earth, and to sow it all with plants, and to distribute animals all over it, in the air, land, and sea. But God did all that in just 6 days. So the polysyndeton, that long run-on sentence, is meant to help you feel how rapidly it happened just by reading about it. The Bible is a great work of literature. It's not just a list of facts and commandments, but it has a music and a rhythm that's designed to move you. This polysyndeton is where the tempo of the music is accelerated to get your heart pounding, to make you excited so you recognize the impact of what's happening. And all that's lost in our modern English translations. I remember thinking, why is there no translation that has this? So I made my own so I could see it on the page and show it to you. Here's an illustration to help you understand the polysyndeton technique. Imagine you meet a 6-year-old child and you say, "What did you do today?" The child says, I went to the zoo and I was with my dad and we saw a lion and we saw a giraffe and we had lunch and I had a burger and we saw the monkeys and dad brought me a t-shirt and there was a room full of butterflies and one landed on me and my dad got a picture. And as the child is speaking, you're wondering, is this ever going to end? Did they do all that stuff that's at the same time? How can the child breathe? That's polysyndeton. Children know how to do it instinctively. It's rapid fire, it's breathless, it's all rolled up in one. And that's what we have in Genesis 1. Isn't that funny? That's how the Bible begins. And someone might say, isn't that childish? That's okay. Jesus said you must become like children to enter the kingdom of heaven. But this same technique used by a child can also be used in a literary masterpiece like the Bible. And it's used here to tie together all the events of the creation week into a single rapid-fire unit. All of creation was made by God in just 6 days. That's fast. Another thing I noticed is all the repetition in this passage. You can see that even in translation. But there are several deliberate symbolic numbers in this text. For example, the phrase, "and God said," appears 10 times. 10 is symbolic for totality and completion. The phrase, "God saw that it was good," the last time very good, appears 7 times. 7 is a symbolic number for perfection and wholeness. The word God is used 35 times, 5 times 7. Earth is used 21 times, 3 times 7. And there's other elements of 7 that scholars have pointed out. Are all these 7s a coincidence in a 7-day creation week? Of course not. But there's no mystical or esoteric meaning behind these numbers. What it shows is structure, order, precision, because the text follows a numeric pattern, just like God made the creation with structure, order, and precision. So the text that describes it is like the creation being described, so again, you can feel it. Also, the numbers 7 and 10 symbolize the perfection of God's creation, its completion and wholeness, and that what's described here is the totality of God's creation. There's nothing outside of that creation week. By the way, this only works if you include the first verse, Genesis 1:1. It has the word God and the word earth. If you leave it out, you don't get the number 7, you don't get perfection and wholeness. One last insight I want to show you is about Genesis 1 verse 2. This verse has 3 phrases that all begin with "and," the first few cars in the train. These 3 all begin with a construction called a disjunctive wow. That's the Hebrew grammar. But it creates what's called a circumstantial clause, which gives information about these circumstances, basically background knowledge. If I say, "the boy threw the ball and the ball was white," the last part about it being white is a circumstantial clause. It's a description of the ball that was thrown in the first clause, not a new thought or a second action. It's the same with verse 2 in the Bible. And that's why I've indented these 3 clauses and set them under the clause they modify, verse 1. What it's describing are the circumstances immediately after God created the heavens and the earth. The earth he created was a deserted desert. It was covered in a deep of water and shrouded in darkness, and the Spirit of God was hovering over those deep waters. This is important because many English translations leave out the first "and," which begins verse 2. They might put "now," or sometimes nothing, and just begin the sentence, "the earth." But then they've left out a word that God chose to put there. Who gave them the authority to do that? And leaving that out breaks the chain of the polysyndeton, thereby separating what God has joined together. What would Jesus think about that? So I want you to know all this, and I want you to see it, because there's a lot of confusion about this, and your favorite English translation might be misleading. By the way, there are some translations that correctly start verse 2 with "and," but very few that use the lowercase a. I prefer. Well, that's enough for one video, but there's still more depth here to explore. And if you want more insights about what's lost in translation, see my other video on the beautiful language of Genesis. In summary, I produced my translation so that we can all see visually the polysyndeton in Genesis 1:1 to 2:3, how it's like a single run-on sentence connected with "ands." The text is all connected to convey that all of the events of Creation Week are connected. It's structured around the numbers 7 and 10 to show that God's creation is structured, orderly, and mathematically precise. It also makes clear that verse 1 is not a title or superscription or an event that takes place before the creation week, because that would break the polysyndeton, where God has joined all these verses, and it would break the numeric perfection. And finally, the author wants you to feel the urgency of these rapid-fire events, a driving rhythm like upbeat music. And just like music that is lively and fun, Genesis 1 is playful, fun, but also structured and mathematical, just like music is. The creation week rushes forward, and this, and this, and this, until it finally stops when God rests. And that rest is a preview of the true Sabbath rest which is found in Christ Jesus. So the creation week doesn't just point back to the beginning, it points forward to Jesus, the one in whom God's work is complete. And that's more of the beautiful language of Genesis 1. Thanks for watching. God bless you.